to the event that's recorded by Josephus. Just to summarize Josephus's accounts of what happened, siege, and more importantly, the mass suicide. And is there any historical corroboration for Josephus's account?
Right. So we can divide the sort of conversation that we're having into two parts, the siege and the fall, right? There is no doubt that there was a siege at Masada. No doubt that there was a Roman siege because the siege works are there. You can still see them today. Every visitor to Masada sees the siege works today. You see the circumvallation wall, which is the siege wall that the Romans built around the base of the mountain. You see the 8 camps that they built circling the mountain at the base to house their troops. You see the assault ramp that they built up the west side, right? So there's no doubt that there was a siege at Masada. And the remains that we have of the siege and the fighting that would have occurred in connection with the construction of the siege works, those remains are really overall quite consistent with Josephus's description of the siege of Masada. So in terms of controversies, the controversy isn't so much about the siege, although my own involvement in sort of the archaeology of Masada really focuses on the siege, because from the siege works, we get really interesting information about how the Romans conducted a siege, in the field. But the controversy, sort of the sensational aspect of the story of Masada, is the fall of the mountain. What happened at the end of the siege, right? And this is because of the nature of our information, which all comes from Josephus. Now, what happens is that, so first of all, a little bit about Josephus. So Josephus was an aristocratic Jewish man who was born in Jerusalem in 37 CE. His name originally was Joseph, son of Mattathias, Yosef ben Mattatyahu. And when the Jewish revolt broke out in 66 CE, the Jews, because they declared independence from Rome, formed their own government and divided the country into districts. And Josephus was put in charge of Galilee, right? And he then oversees Galilee until it falls to the Romans. It was the very first part of Galilee to be taken by the Romans. Sorry, it was the very first part of the country to be taken by the Romans. I don't know if I should go, well, I guess actually, okay, I was trying to do this in a short way, but I think I have to do it in a long way because there's no way around it. All right, so let's do it a little more completely. So what happens is that after the Jews proclaim independence from Rome, form a provisional government, Josephus is put in charge of Galilee. The Romans send troops to put down the revolt. And those troops were under the command of a general named Vespasian, who assembles his forces at Antioch in Syria and marches south. And the very first part of the country that the Romans marched against, that they reached, was Galilee, which was under Josephus's command. And so what happens is that one by one, the Jewish towns and fortresses of Galilee fall to the Romans because they were just no match for the Romans, until finally Josephus found himself holed up in a cistern on the side of the last remaining fortress under his command in Galilee, which was called Yotvata in Hebrew, or in Greek, Yotvata. And there Josephus found himself with 40 soldiers under his command, who all decided that they would rather commit mass suicide than give themselves up alive to the Romans. And Josephus, by the way, didn't like the idea, but he had to go along with the majority. And so they drew lots. And as Josephus writes, through fate or contrivance, he drew the last lot. And instead of then committing suicide, as per the pact, he gave himself up alive to the Romans, which is why, sort of in the view of Jewish history, Josephus is considered a traitor to the Jews. And at that point, then, Josephus was led before the Roman commander, Vespasian, the Roman general. Why didn't Vespasian simply kill Josephus outright? Well, Josephus was very smart, and he predicted that one day Vespasian would become emperor of the Roman Empire. Now, you have to understand what was happening in Rome at this point. We're in the year 67 CE. At this point, Nero is the emperor in Rome. It is 3 years after the Great Fire. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Because of that fire, Nero was incredibly unpopular among the Roman public because that fire had wiped out areas where a lot of the housing for lower class people were located. And so instead of rebuilding their housing, Nero appropriated the land for his own and built a magnificent palace called the Golden House on the property. And so Nero in 67 was incredibly unpopular. Josephus knew it, undoubtedly, and, suspected that Vespasian, as a powerful general, probably would like to be emperor. And so he made his prediction. He's taken alive into captivity. And a year later, 68, Nero is dead. And a year later, 69, Vespasian is proclaimed emperor of the Roman Empire. And it then falls to Vespasian's older son, Titus, to have to carry out the siege of Jerusalem. And so what happens then is that Josephus accompanies Titus during the siege of Jerusalem. He actually circled the walls and tried to persuade the Jews in the city to surrender to the Romans. It didn't work. The Jews apparently threw stones at him instead. And after the fall of Jerusalem in 70, Josephus went to Rome. He was given Roman citizenship, where he then adopts a Roman name, Flavius Josephus. Flavius is the name of the family of Vespasian, right? Vespasian established the Flavian dynasty. And Josephus was then commissioned by the Romans, his Roman patrons, to write a series of history books of the Jewish people. And the first of these is a massive 7-volume work called The Jewish War, which is basically the story of the first Jewish revolt against the Romans. And Josephus chose to end his story of the Jewish War with the fall of Masada. Now, the reason why the story of the mass suicide at Masada, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, is so controversial is because we don't have it described in any other ancient author. No other ancient source talks about the siege and fall of Masada. Only Josephus does. And there's a question about why no other Roman sources, talk about it. Was it something that they didn't want other people to know about, or what? I think it's most likely, actually, that that for the Romans, in the eyes of the Romans after the fall of Jerusalem in 70, anything else that they were taking was sort of mopping up operations, very minor in their eyes, and didn't deserve really to be discussed. I mean, there's no reason to devote anything to it. But for whatever reason, Josephus chose to end his story of the Jewish War with the story of Masada and the sort of mass suicide that occurs at the end of the siege. And because we have no other ancient sources, outside sources, that talk about this episode, for example, Tacitus, the Roman historian, talks about the siege of Jerusalem, but he doesn't mention Masada. So because of that, it's impossible to corroborate, to say, oh, we have another independent outside source. If you were doing journalism today, right, and you were reporting on a story, if you're a good journalist, you're not going to rely on just one source without corroboration, right? And so it is with the story of the mass suicide of Masada. So what happens is that, according to Josephus, after 70, the Romans go back and, to Rome. Vespasian and Titus have a big victory parade through the streets of Rome. Eventually, the Arch of Titus is erected in the Roman Forum to commemorate their victory, and so on. But there remained, after 70, 3 former fortified Herodian palaces still holding out in the hands of Jewish rebels: Herodium, Machaerus, and Masada. And so the Romans send troops to take these 3 last holdouts, right? First, they march against Herodium, which apparently fell very quickly without a fight. Then they march against Machaerus, which today is in Jordan on the other side of the Dead Sea, where there is a siege. There's a siege ramp there, but it was never completed because the Jews surrendered before the end of the siege. And then finally, either in the year 72 or 73, the Romans arrive at the foot of Masada. And it's very interesting, by the way, the Romans sent an enormous force to take Masada. They send approximately 8,000 men to the foot of Masada, when, remember that there's like 967 men, women, and children holding out on top of the mountain, which raises the question, why the overkill? And apparently it's for a couple of good reasons. Number one, the Romans wanted to make sure that they stamped out every last spark of Jewish resistance, so they didn't want these rebels to come down and start the revolt up all over again. But the Romans also ruled a large empire with many different native peoples, and they didn't want anybody else to get the idea that you could revolt against Rome and get away with it, right? So they're basically making a statement here. So they send this huge force. The Romans arrive at the foot of Masada. They set up the siege. They seal off the mountain with a circumvallation wall. They build camps to house their soldiers. And then they construct a massive assault ramp up the western side of the mountain so that they can get their battering ram into place. and they start battering through the wall at the top of the mountain. And what I've just described up to this point is really not controversial, because we have the archaeological remains of the siege works. The next part of the story is where the controversy is. So according to Josephus's account, what happens at this point is that the Jewish rebels on top of the mountain see that, the Romans are about to take it. And their leader, Eleazar ben Yattir, convenes all of the men together, perhaps in a room that Yadin identified on top of the mountain as a synagogue, right, an assembly hall. And he gives them a speech in which he convinces them that the best way to rob the Romans of their hard-won victory and preserve their own honor would be if they commit suicide at their own hand rather than give themselves up alive to the Romans. Sort of sounds familiar, right? Like Yotvata. And he convinces them to do this. And so what they do then is that every man takes his wife and children and kills them. And then all the men get together and they draw lots. And out of them, 10 men kill all of the others. And then those 10 remaining men get together and draw lots again. And out of them, 1 man kills the other 9, and then finally commits suicide himself. Now, before I go on, one of the reasons why the story, this story at Masada has been so controversial and sensational is because it's always described as a mass suicide, right? Well, technically, there's only one person who dies at their own hand here. Everybody else was murdered or killed by somebody else. And of course, this has been controversial because, Jewish law prohibits suicide. But as my distinguished colleague, Larry Schiffman at New York University points out,
murder as well
is prohibited by Jewish law. So either way, right? Anyway, now, if all of these people had committed mass suicide, how do we know the story then, right? So the story goes that not everybody actually committed suicide or died. A couple of old women overheard the plans to commit suicide, and they hid out in a cistern on the side of the mountain with some children. And when the Romans came up, they gave themselves up alive. And then somehow, either directly or indirectly, that story was told to Josephus, who then records it for us. Right now, when Yigael Yadin excavated the top of Masada in the 1960s, he understood Josephus literally. In other words, he believed that the story was true. And this is not a criticism. This is just, that was the way scholarship understood Josephus at that time. So Yadin was perfectly within, sort of the spirit, the scholarly, spirit and worldview at that time. But since then, other scholars have called Josephus's reliability into question. Depending on how, again, who you are and what your scholarly sort of background and outlook is, Josephus is either somewhat reliable or pretty unreliable or completely unreliable, right? So there's kind of a whole range of opinions on this. But with regard to the mass suicide story at Masada, so what some scholars have pointed out in recent years is that the story of mass suicide, episodes where you have a story that ends with a mass suicide, that occur over and over again in Josephus. So we saw it at Yotvata. There's something sort of similar at Gamla in the Golan. There are all these episodes where people commit mass suicide. And what these scholars have asked is, well, is it possible that all these people really were committing mass suicide? Or could it be that Josephus invented this, fabricated it, as an ending to make the story more exciting? And by the way, if he did, it worked, because we wouldn't be here talking about Masada if it wasn't for the mass suicide story, because it would be just like every other Herodian fortified palace, right? So could it be that Josephus, sort of invented this as an ending to the story to make it more exciting, more gripping? Now, you might be wondering then, well, wait a minute, but isn't there a way that we can sort of, there are various objections to that might come to mind. So one would be, well, wait a minute, wouldn't the Romans have objected to Josephus fabricating an ending to the story that wasn't true? I mean, after all, they were there. But there you would have the modern expectation of objective history, if such a thing even exists, whereas there was no such expectation or concept in the ancient world. In fact, the Greeks and the Romans wrote and read histories not for objectivity, as an expectation, again, that many people might have today, but rather in order to be entertained, to learn about things that were exotic, and also for morals. There's usually a moral to the story, right? So fabricating an ending to the story would not necessarily have bothered Roman readers. But then you might wonder, well, wait a minute, wouldn't the Romans have objected to Josephus fabricating an ending to a story that elevated the Jews in the eyes of their readers? Because, you know, when you read Eleazar ben Yattir speaking to, you know, the men there, you know, it sounds like, well, they're heroic and noble in preferring death at their own hand than death in slavery at the hands of the Romans, right? So wouldn't the Romans have objected to that? But again, no, not necessarily, because, you know, there's no glory in defeating a weak enemy. Your own victory is elevated if your enemy is heroic and noble, right? So you can't really, I mean, there's not really a good basis for rejecting outright the possibility that Josephus fabricated the sort of mass suicide as an ending to the story. But then you might wonder, well, wait a minute, doesn't archaeology tell us whether the mass suicide occurred or not? And the answer is no, it does not. Because you can take the same archaeological remains and interpret them either way, depending on how you interpret Josephus. And to give you just a couple of examples. So when Yadin excavated the top of Masada in the 1960s, he did not find 967 skeletons on top of the mountain. He did not. He found 3 skeletons, a man, woman, and child, who apparently are Jewish rebels or a Jewish family, buried in the collapse of the lowest terrace of the Northern Palace complex. And he found another group of skeletons, not clear how many there were exactly, somewhere between 5 to 25, in a cistern on the southeast side of the mountain. And it's not even clear that those skeletons are Jewish rebels. They could be Roman soldiers, they could be Byzantine monks. We don't know for sure. And that's it. He didn't find any other skeletons. So what did Yadin say? Again, Yadin is assuming that Josephus' story is true. So what Yadin said is, well, okay, everybody commits mass suicide. The Romans come up to the top of the mountain. They find all these corpses lying around. Well, the Romans left a garrison on top of Masada for a couple of decades after the end of the siege. So obviously they wouldn't have left rotting corpses lying around. They would have disposed of them by either burying them in a mass pit somewhere or maybe cremating them. So we don't have their remains. Now let's assume for a minute that the mass suicide story isn't true, that the Romans come up and there's some fighting and some of the rebels are killed and others are led away into slavery. Same thing, right? The corpses would have been disposed of. Now, something that many of your listeners may be familiar with. So if you've been to the top of Masada, there's a room or sort of, yeah, kind of like a room, an area next to the large bathhouse in the Northern Palace complex where the lots were found, right? That's always pointed out. Here's where the lots were found. And indeed, Yadin identified that room as the spot where the lots were found. So what did he find there? He found a group of ostraca, which are potsherds that are inscribed, right? They have writing on them, in this case, in ink. And in this case, very interestingly, the ostraca have Hebrew names on them. And in fact, one of the names actually is Ben Yattir, which is very, very interesting. And Yadin identified these as lots, as the lots. And so what's the problem with that? First of all, the problem is that there are not 10 ostraca in the group. There were 12. One of them clearly had never been completed, so Yadin disregarded it. Okay, but you still have 11 and not 10. And so what did Yadin say? Well, he said, well, you know, one of them is Ben Yattir. Ben Yattir was the head of the rebels, and we can sort of exclude him. I don't know, the reasoning is a little bit dicey there, but that's how he got to 10. And then he identified those as the lots. Now, after Yadin died, an untimely death, by the way, in 1984, the material from his excavations, which was not published in a final scientific report, was given to various other archaeologists and scholars for publication. And eventually, those ostraca were studied and published by also a very eminent late specialist, Joseph Neve of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who was a leading expert on ancient writing, a paleographer. And so he published that group of ostraca, and he was unable to conclude that those were in fact the lots. And the reason is that we have groups of ostraca, inscribed potsherds, from various contexts dating to the time of the revolt around Masada, and it's clear that these were used for various purposes, like meal ration tickets or whatever. You have to think of these things like our Post-it notes today, right? So you would take a piece of broken pottery instead of a Post-it note and write on it. And so are they the lots? I guess they could be the lots, but they don't have to be the lots. They could be something else, right? So in other words, archaeology does not prove or disprove the historicity of the story of the mass suicide on top of Masada. And really what it boils down to in the end is a matter of how you evaluate Josephus's reliability as an historian in terms of whether you think that that mass suicide story is true or not.